Good afternoon. I'm Kelleann Foster. I'm the director of the Stuckman School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at Penn State. I also am the lead faculty for our online Geodesign graduate programs. So I'm really pleased to have this amazing group here. I wanted to say one more thing too. I've had several conversations with people about trying to get the word out more about geodesign, and we've just started a hashtag Why I Geodesign. So if you want to start using that and start following that, get the stories out there about why I geodesign and share it with everybody, build the dialogue about it. So this is going to be an interesting one this afternoon. It's and I don't know when we're ending, so you have to. I was going to keep time, but you tell me, Ryan. So this is literally our soup to nuts session, right? So soup. First course, nuts used to be dessert. I like chocolate cake, but nuts sometimes. Anyway, so we've got the whole range here from autonomous vehicles to autonomous cameras in the wildlife, I guess. I don't know. So tough act to follow. That was amazing. Really, really exciting. So I wonder, and you didn't, I guess you just flew in, right? So you didn't get to see everybody else's. You saw a little bit of Joe, you said, mm-hmm. right? So let me start with Joe. You did one of your scenarios was actually the value you were doing it, looking at stormwater for one of the communities. What do you think about? Could you do something connecting Carlton and his group with doing something with underappreciated lands and helping build understanding about these values of our the ecosystem services and wildlife value and tourism potential, all that?
Yeah, and actually it's kind of odd to be the first one with the mic after your show because we're actually doing work in Collier County, trying to keep them out of the spaces that you talk about to preserve and keep the lure of the greed of the easy development away from them. But we use maps of mapping value. And there's a couple, I'm over here taking copious notes because, are you aware of Benton McKay and the Appalachian Trail? So in 1921, Benton McKay walked into a landscape architecture conference and put this map up showing a trail that could go through the whole mountain range from Georgia all the way to New Hampshire. And within 16 years, that trail was done. And it's watching your story and seeing you talk about this, there could be a trail here, and then starting to see the map put that vision out there. It was just like Benton McKay all over again. And you're following in those footsteps, which is really amazing. And it reminds me of the Florida landscapes with Clyde Butcher doing those photographs and showing people the spaces they don't go into in Florida. And that's the challenge that we see. The agriculture that I presented of the cows in Palm Bay, those landscapes are used purely for almost subsidy on the coast. The center belongs to old Florida. So anyway, we're just trying to show those numbers as well and trying to get people to see how the greed can take over and cause more problems than it helps. But I feel your pain in that.
Yeah, so one of the things I thought was really cool is that your bear basically knew where all the green infrastructure was. I mean, the little yellow dots, so I know you're learning more about Esri's resources, but I think, didn't Jack talk about this the day one, that they're mapping all the green infrastructure in the country and making it available to people because they want this to happen. But I just love how the bear knows this. You don't have to map it for the bear. They know it, right? And then he also knew the limits and where the problem was because he ran against that barrier there. He, she, we don't know. I know some of your photos, you know if they're...
that one was a he.
That was a he.
They put a collar on it so they know his...
Oh, that's right. That's when that's right.
And it's a young male that's going to have no luck in his dating life if he sticks around his home range. So he's motivated to go find new territory.
Okay, very interesting. Well, and I think it's interesting that you're coming to this idea of the maps and the power of maps, and that's one of the things I kind of see a theme sort of here. I'm trying to find a theme of the power of different ways of communicating and connecting our information with the public. And one of the kind of central tenets of geodesign is creative change for a place. And part of that creative change could be keeping it special and making sure that it doesn't change in a negative way. And so the idea of coupling your amazing photographs with mapping, with some dialogue and details about the financial implications, is really kind of exciting. And I wonder if, along those lines of communication issues, I know, Robert, you showed with your surveys that you had, you included maps with your surveys in a lot of cases. And did you have any problem with people understanding because sometimes people don't understand 2D maps. Have you thought about putting 3D in there, or has that been anything that's been part of the communication process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the 3D actually adds some more richness to the story, right? Mm-hmm. So the story maps that we put together were very tailored to a community. So we chose particular locations that we wanted to get feedback on. But yeah, absolutely, we have other examples I didn't bring today. But
Okay.
using 3D scenes where there's topography or there's interface that you want to kind of investigate. Some of the examples that I had were just basically land use based, use and opportunity based on directing policy, whether it's general plan or zoning policy. So.
Yeah, okay. And David, the type of work that you're getting into here with this this idea of the death of the steady state is, and so one of the things whenever I do presentations, I talk about that really change is the new constant. Nothing's staying the same anymore. And I'm wondering, when you look at this, how does the notion of resilience and some of the conservation issue, how does that fit into this idea of the death of stationarity?
That's a really interesting question. Of course, like everyone, I found Carlton, I found your presentation really inspiring, and I just kind of started thinking, I talked about this idea in the context of climate change and autonomous vehicles. So in this new world, this new age we're in, the new era of uncertainty, can autonomous vehicles and the Florida Panther coexist? And I actually think they can, thinking about it, because you've got, again, the opportunities that I brought up this morning about, and not just me, others are talking about the fact, potentially from autonomous vehicles, we won't have to devote as much infrastructure to roads, to pavement, to parking, which opens up green infrastructure opportunities. So, and that's resilience to me, is looking at locally based solutions like green infrastructure and scaling them up to a massive scale, like at the scale of a state like Florida. So that's just a couple of thoughts I have on that.
Okay, great. So Melissa, you posed a couple times, you posed the question, is what I'm doing, is this geodesign? And I know Bill Miller, who was one of the early emissaries of geodesign here at Esri, he kind of says there's 3 stages of geodesign, of GIS evolution. The first was data, finding data and binding that and securing it with maps. The second was analysis and doing something with that data. And the third stage, and that's geodesign, that's when you do creative change. You do the design with all that information. So when you're asking, is it geodesign, I guess I would ask, my partial answer to your question would be, did what you've been doing, do you consider that you were doing creative change? Or was that something you said you weren't able to share because you couldn't get to the evaluation pieces?
The question is what we're doing as planners and urban designers creative change?
Well, you had asked if what you were doing there was geodesign. And I didn't see a lot of design or creative change there. You were finding great locations for things, which is an important use of GIS. So I was curious if you feel like you're introducing some idea of creative change, but you talked about there's some pieces that didn't happen, so I'm just curious about.
Not on all projects, certainly.
Yeah.
I think most of the time that's what we're striving for. I think some of the things that we're asked to do as consultants are to plug into other processes and to do that in a way that you can contribute to a larger whole. Sometimes what that means in practice is that you are passing your information on in a chain to a lot of other people. I think the provocation of that talk is that there could be a more productive armature where we're not just passing information to each other, but actually we're all building into the same system.
Yeah, and that was actually going to be the second part of my my question to you, your proposed slight addendum to and the idea of the collaboration. And I think what you're proposing sounds very interesting, that it's set up in such a way that the next consultant or the next agency can build on it. And right now, maybe you're saying things are too siloed, sort of? Is that kind of way?
Perhaps maybe just sort of passing the football to each other is not the best way to hold on to all of the information and all of the value of our work. Oftentimes when that happens, there's a lot of work that needs to be repeated. There's usually what happens at the beginning of a process for consultant work that's called verification. Verification means that you probably are doing some work over that the other consultant did. And whether that's because you need to, because all of the information wasn't passed on to you, or because some of the designers in the room are just outright rejecting the findings of the previous consultants.
Yes, right.
But is there a way that we can just do that a little bit better?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Okay.
That's kind of the question I was, when I was designing my wish of
Yeah.
a common framework. Like, do those, I'm going to sound naive in even asking this, but does something exist where, like whether it's under a green infrastructure that Esri is the cloud source for or something, but we have half a dozen state agencies, 3 or 4 federal agencies, a dozen NGOs, all making their own versions of maps that are saying the similar thing to a small choir type audience, or how can we have a common framework to the because if you're competing for mind space for a road proposal that's this massive thing that all the developers and everyone throws all their energy behind, everyone who's advocating for the balance should be throwing into the same common framework too.
Yeah.
Kelleann, can I say something?
Yeah,
'Cause
please, go ahead.
One thing, Melissa, I really liked about your presentation was like the last 2 slides, and the one that showed sort of the
Circular.
conceptual circle with, and as a planner, I really related to this. You have the plans, you have, you move into implementation, regulations, and that's, and then into development. It happens on the ground. So it's really a continuous circle, a cycle. It's a system. We tend to talk about projects. So we've seen great projects, this project here, this project there, but are they going to add up to what we need to, for example, protect the Florida panther? So if we can come up with this broader framework, as we're all talking about, that would be a great leap forward.
Go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
I want to jump on that because Melissa's challenge is, are we iterating? Are we going back to the information with new knowledge? And the case of the Florida panther, this has been decades of trying to not mess it up. And so we do bridges, we do different things, and there's new data now, there's new information now. We should be iterating and learning from that. And it's been the challenge in Florida all along, this like constant amnesia. But for the urban growth boundary in Dade County keeping Miami hemmed in, but the attitude of seeing that as a river that's flowing through the state has been difficult to get people to realize, and yet they keep on repeating the same mistakes. We talk to people on the west coast of Florida, and I say, well, look, you're looking just like Broward all of a sudden. And they're like, oh, we're not Broward, which is the east coast of Florida. And they're looking just like Broward did 20 years ago, repeating those same mistakes because it's easier to hear from a developer talking about money. And I'll close with McHarg. In the book, he says we need to put a value on the panther, on that habitat, the same way we put the value on a strip mall or a subdivision. And he says to all of us, geodesigners, the man on the moon will know the value of a gallon of oxygen. What would you pay for a gallon of oxygen if you're on the moon? That's the value of nature. And so this is what we need to start articulating to people.
Oh, I don't need that. So, and actually, another question I had. So, one of the, David, you showed a couple different examples of playing out some of these scenarios with autonomous vehicles and some other. I'm wondering if you know of other examples of efforts at doing the scenario planning for looking forward the future that others might be interested in checking out too.
Yeah, well, obviously scenario planning goes way back.
Well,
before
sure.
Geodesign,
Yeah.
So
Right.
and I think it's an important point to make. Actually, the military started the idea. The corporate sector picked it up. Peter Schwartz, Art of the Long View, great book, Royal Dutch Shell back in the 60s. It's strategic thinking, but it was also storytelling. They just thought of plausible stories about how the future could turn out, and then how do we plan for that? So now the geodesign brings this opportunity to layer onto this data, information, modeling, and none of actually what I showed, they've actually done that. They just kind of sketched out, like Andres Sevstuk at Harvard sketched out some scenarios. That's the next stage that we need. There's actually Fair and Peers recently came out with a study where they did model some regional transportation models, inserted autonomous vehicles, made some assumption, and started looking at how it affected VMTs. So it's starting to happen, but a lot more work needs to be done.
And you said the Lincoln Land Institute, we're just talking about
Lincoln
that.
Land,
and
I got to give a plug to our good partner, Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. There's a great landlines issue out there on the Colorado
Free,
River
you can pick
Basin.
up if you didn't pick it up yet.
Which talks about scenario planning in terms of water, and they've started a scenario planning consortium. So they're really promoting this idea and looking in that particular instance how it applies to water. So again, to me, it's geodesign. If it's done right, if it's done smart, and there's a lot of potential.
Mm-hmm. I think the whole idea of, again, we're kind of the choir here, right? So how do we get this message out? And I wrote down, I think it was, Robert, you said we're doing trade-off exercises with people. I'm like, that, instead of scenario planning, people are, the average Joe's not, but the idea of we're doing an exercise, we're going to look at trade-offs. People can understand that. I think sometimes we have to look at our vocabulary and make things more accessible. And you were also doing, you're talking about doing stripped-down general plans that you're putting in story maps. And talk a little bit more about your approach to trying to make it more accessible to the public.
Well, yeah, exactly. I think you hit right on the message I was trying to evoke. A lot of these policies and these documents, like a general plan, are very complex documents, and for those uninitiated folks, they're intimidating. So we thought, well, if we want to engage the community, we tried to engage the community in the process, but why aren't we engaging them after that process is done, right? To keep them activated, keep, kind of a check and balance. And I think Colin mentioned that, one of my colleague at PlaceWorks, when working on the general plan or the countywide plan at San Bernardino, is that they built that in. They have this check and balance system, this feedback loop, to kind of still keep the policy grounded, but also kind of keep that dialogue open for change, right? Because like David had just mentioned, planning is, it's very, just constantly evolving, and, policy constantly changes, it has to adapt as society changes and values change, like your example in Florida, changing policy and the evolution of that, happens. I think, geodesign has to be that sort of cyclical kind of endless loop. Yeah.
I sometimes talk to our students about, okay, you're doing this presentation now, pretend like you're giving it to your grandmother, right? So to make it accessible to the general public. And that's why I think a lot of what I've heard today is trying to, you can be at a high level of thinking and really exciting visions, but if the general public or the decision makers, which is an important part of geodesign, is understanding who the decision makers are and what they need to know, if you can't communicate it to them in a way that'll resonate, then you're not going to get very far, right? Yeah.
If I could add to that, oftentimes we're thinking the same thing. How do we speak about the results of this analysis in a way that's very accessible? But I think I'm going to leave the session today replacing the word accessible with the word captivating.
Yeah,
because
sure.
I'm having a hard time forming complete sentences right now. I don't know about you guys, because I'm just thinking about those images are just so beautiful. Mm-hmm. And like, what can I do to help? I'm getting my checkbook out there in the audience. Like, who do I send money to? What do I do?
Yeah.
So maybe we should be thinking about that as we're trying to engage communities. Is let's add a layer at the end of geodesign that says, let's figure out a way to captivate this audience and not just,
Inform,
exactly.
Yeah. I think we should end it there, Ryan. That's fabulous. I agree. Okay. Great.